Please picture this with me. You're standing in a candlelit hall, the smell of roasting meat thick in the air. A crowd of strangers stares at you, their eyes sharp and curious. In front of you, a man or woman you've only met a handful of times, if at all, waits wearing stiff, formal clothes that scratch the skin. You've just been married, and from this moment on, your life will probably never truly be your own again. If you were alive in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't about romance. It wasn't even about personal choice. It was about alliances, property, power, and survival. And survival, frankly, wasn't guaranteed. Think about this. You might have been promised to your spouse before you could even walk. You might be no more than 12 years old, standing beside a partner twice or 3 times your age. The marriage bed would not be a place of intimacy, but of duty, and perhaps of fear. Even the wedding itself could be a public spectacle. In some regions, the bedding ceremony, where you were led to the marital bed, was witnessed by family and guests, who laughed, cheered, and made crude jokes. Privacy wasn't a right, it was almost a fantasy. And beyond the wedding day loomed the risks no one could truly protect you from. Childbirth, which could kill you just as easily as it could bring new life. Disease, which swept through villages and castles without mercy. A legal system that made you the property of your spouse, with little to no recourse if they were abusive. For men, marriage could still be a dangerous gamble. A dowry might bankrupt your family. An influential wife could embroil you in deadly political intrigue, and, if you displeased the wrong in-law, you might find yourself on the wrong end of a sword or a poisoned cup. But for women, the odds were even worse. Survival depended on your husband's goodwill, your ability to bear children, and sheer luck. And luck was often in short supply. So, before you romanticize the idea of a medieval wedding with garlands and minstrels, remember this. In the Middle Ages, "Till death do us part" wasn't a poetic promise. It was a grim reality, and death might come far sooner than you'd think. Because in this world, marriage wasn't about happily ever after. It was about navigating a dangerous, often brutal bargain, one where the cost could be your freedom or your life. And this was just the beginning of the nightmare. Let's step back in time, into the shadowy corridors of the medieval world, and see exactly what kind of trap a marriage could be. To understand why medieval marriage could be so deadly, we need to step into the world that shaped it. A world where faith, politics, and survival were tangled into a single unbreakable knot. The Middle Ages, roughly spanning from the 5th to the late 15th century, were not one uniform block of time. Life in a small farming village in 12th century England was drastically different from life in a 14th century French court. But across Europe, one thing remained constant. Marriage was never just between two people. It was between families, clans, and sometimes entire kingdoms. The church dominated nearly every aspect of life. Marriage was considered a holy sacrament, overseen and sanctified by religious authorities. But while the church preached spiritual ideals, the reality was often cold and transactional. Noble families used marriage to secure alliances, cement peace treaties, and consolidate wealth. Even among peasants, a union was rarely a matter of love. It was a strategy to combine land, merge labor, or gain protection. For the aristocracy, marriage was a weapon in the political arsenal. A daughter might be married off to an older, foreign noble to secure an alliance. And she might be sent hundreds of miles away from her family to a strange court, surrounded by strangers who spoke a different language. Refusal was rarely an option. Obedience was a duty. Among commoners, things were hardly better. Villagers lived under the watchful eye of the local lord, who often had the right to approve marriages between his tenants. In some regions, a feudal custom known as merché meant peasants had to pay a fee to their lord for the right to marry. It was a stark reminder. Even the act of falling in love came at a price. Daily life in this era was grueling. Most people lived in cramped, poorly heated homes with dirt floors. Hygiene was minimal, disease was rampant, and life expectancy was shockingly low, often under 40 years. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for women, and medical care, such as it was, could be as dangerous as the illness itself. Social expectations were rigid. Women, regardless of class, were expected to be obedient wives and mothers. Their role was to manage the household, bear children, and uphold their husband's reputation. Men were expected to provide, protect, and if necessary, defend their family by force. Love, if it grew at all, was a luxury that came after marriage, not before. Marriage contracts were drawn up like business deals, detailing dowries, property rights, and inheritance. A noblewoman's dowry might include gold, land, or servants. A peasant bride might bring a cow, a small plot of land, or tools. These arrangements were legally binding, and breaking them could lead to public scandal or worse. And hanging over everything was the reality of law and custom. In many places, a wife was legally considered her husband's property. She could not own land independently, and her testimony in court carried less weight than a man's. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime. If a woman fled an abusive husband, she could be forcibly returned. The church preached marital harmony, but it also reinforced obedience. Husbands were urged to love their wives, but wives were instructed to submit to their husbands. Divorce, as we think of it today, was almost impossible. At best, one could seek an annulment if they had the money, influence, and evidence to prove the marriage was invalid. This was the world in which medieval marriages took place, a web of duty, law, and danger. Love stories did exist, hidden in the pages of troubadour songs, whispered in market squares, but they were rare sparks against the backdrop of a harsh, unforgiving reality. And yet, within this rigid world, tales began to emerge. Stories of strange traditions, whispered scandals, and the darker side of married life. Some were too bizarre to believe, others too horrifying to ignore. Behind the stone walls of castles and the thatched roofs of villages, medieval marriage carried with it a library of whispered tales, part cautionary, part scandalous, and often tinged with fear. These stories, passed from mouth to mouth, blurred the lines between fact and rumor, history and superstition. One of the most persistent whispers came from the bedding ceremony. In certain regions, after the wedding feast ended, the bride and groom were led to the marital bed, not in private, but accompanied by friends, family, and even servants. Witnesses claimed the couple was sometimes stripped to their undergarments, tucked in by the crowd, and left with bawdy jokes ringing in their ears. Some swore that in noble courts it wasn't just symbolic. Curtains were drawn, but the rustling of sheets and the watching eyes of attendants were all too real. Whether exaggerated or not, the story underscored one truth. In marriage, privacy was almost non-existent. Then there were the legends of trial marriages in remote villages. These were whispered arrangements where a couple might live together for a year before deciding to wed formally. On paper, it was a way to ensure fertility and compatibility. In practice, it could trap a young woman. If she became pregnant, she had little choice but to marry, regardless of the man's character. Such tales often carried a grim ending, a bride locked into a life she never truly chose. Other rumors told of cursed unions. Medieval Europe was a deeply superstitious place, and an ill-matched marriage could be blamed on witchcraft or divine punishment. A barren couple might be whispered about in the market square, accused of offending God. A wife who spoke too freely could be labeled bewitched and feared as dangerous. In noble circles, political marriages bred their own stories, some disturbingly true. There were accounts of brides poisoned within weeks of the wedding, victims of rival factions. Chronicles spoke of husbands who disappeared shortly after inheriting their wife's land. The cause of death, conveniently, illness or accident. Among peasants, the tales were no less chilling. In some folk tales, a miserly husband starved his wife to death, hiding her body to avoid paying for a Christian burial. In others, a wife poisoned her husband with a carefully brewed herb tea, whispered to her by a traveling gloud. Wise woman. These stories served as both entertainment and warning. Marriage could be as dangerous as war. Not all rumors were grim. There were romantic ballads of star-crossed lovers, defying family orders, escaping into the night, and marrying in secret before a village priest. But even these hopeful tales often ended in tragedy, capture, annulment, or exile. Medieval audiences seemed to understand instinctively. In their world, love rarely triumphed over duty. One of the most enduring rumors concerned love potions. Traveling peddlers and cunning folk sold powders and brews said to inflame passion or bind a spouse's loyalty. Some claimed these concoctions worked. Others said they killed more often than they cured. The church condemned them as witchcraft, but their popularity never truly faded. Whether these legends were true, half-true, or pure invention, they all shared one thing. They reflected the deep unease people felt about marriage. Beneath the church's solemn vows and the Lord's approving nod, there was a constant undercurrent of fear that the person you were bound to for life might also be the one who destroyed you. But were these just fireside stories meant to pass the long winter nights? Or did real evidence exist to show how dangerous marriage could be? Let's turn from the realm of rumor into the cold, recorded facts. If the rumors and legends of medieval marriage paint a chilling picture, the surviving records, legal documents, church decrees, and eyewitness accounts confirm that many of those fears were justified. Let's start with the cold, bureaucratic truth: marriage contracts. Across medieval Europe, from the courts of France to the manors of England, contracts recorded not vows of love, but lists of obligations. In noble families, these could stretch over pages, detailing exactly what each spouse brought to the union: dowries in gold, parcels of land, livestock, even political favors. In some contracts, the bride's age is noted, often disturbingly young. Records from 14th century England, for instance, include multiple instances of girls as young as 12 being married to men in their 30s or 40s. Court archives also reveal the dangerous legal imbalance between spouses. Under the doctrine of coverture, a woman's legal identity was effectively absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. She could not own property independently, could not enter into contracts, and had virtually no legal standing without his consent. This meant that if a husband was abusive, the law offered little protection. The 13th century legal treatise Fleta bluntly stated that the husband has the correction and chastisement of his wife. In other words, the beating of a wife was not only tolerated, it was legally sanctioned in many regions. Medical records, sparse though they are, add another layer of grim evidence. Parish registers and coroners' rolls from across England, France, document shocking maternal mortality rates. In some villages, as many as 1 in 3 women died in childbirth or from postpartum complications. These statistics weren't limited to peasants. Noble women also faced deadly risks, as illustrated by the fate of Queen Jane Seymour, third wife of Henry VIII, who died of postnatal infection in 1537. Then there are the court cases. One 14th century record from the ecclesiastical courts of York tells of a woman named Alice de la Haye, who sought an annulment on the grounds that her husband had tried to murder her by pushing her into a well. The court sided with her, an unusual outcome, but only after multiple witnesses testified. In most cases, such appeals failed, and the woman was forced back to her husband. In noble circles, marriage could also be a deadly political trap. Chronicles of the Burgundian court recount the fate of Margaret of Burgundy, who was accused of adultery in 1314 and imprisoned in harsh conditions until her death. Many historians suspect her crime was a fabricated pretext to remove her from a politically inconvenient marriage. Even the church's own archives hold dark stories. In 15th century Florence, a series of ecclesiastical trials revealed the existence of ammazzatoio, a colloquial term for murder marriages, in which one spouse, often the wife, was killed shortly after the union to reclaim her dowry or consolidate property. Priests sometimes suspected foul play, but lacked the authority or the will to intervene. Archaeology has also unearthed grim corroboration. Excavations in medieval cemeteries occasionally reveal multiple women of childbearing age, buried in rapid succession, their remains showing signs of difficult labor. In some cases, small skeletons lie beside them, evidence of fatal deliveries. For men, marriage carried different but no less lethal risks. Inheritance disputes could turn violent. Records from 14th century Normandy detail a case in which a groom was poisoned by his wife's relatives over contested property rights. Among peasants, a husband might be targeted if his new wife's family believed he had cheated them in a dowry agreement, an accusation that could end in a bloody feud. The cultural mindset of the time accepted these dangers as part of life. Chroniclers rarely expressed outrage at child marriage, arranged unions, or spousal violence. Instead, such events were noted alongside harvest yields and weather reports, a chilling reminder of how normalized they were. And perhaps the most damning evidence of all comes from the sheer frequency of these cases. These weren't rare anomalies. They were part of the fabric beyond politics, perhaps even beyond this world. For all the documented brutality of medieval marriage, some stories don't fit neatly into court records or legal treatises. They belong to the twilight realm between history and the supernatural. Cases where fear, superstition, and unexplained events became part of a couple's fate. Take the case of Lady Eleanor of Alnwick, recorded in a fragmentary 15th century Northumbrian chronicle. On the night of her wedding, she reportedly collapsed during the bedding ceremony, clutching her throat and gasping for air. Witnesses claimed a foul smell, like rotting flowers, filled the chamber, though no poison was ever found. She died before dawn, and her husband swore he saw a shadowy figure at the foot of their bed, moments before she took her last breath. Some blamed witchcraft, others divine retribution for an unholy match arranged against her will. In rural France, parish records from the Auvergne region tell of a bride named Marie de la Roche, who refused her arranged marriage. On her wedding night in 1382, she was found wandering outside in the snow, barefoot and incoherent, speaking of a man in black, who whispered that she would be buried alive in her vows. She lived another 6 months before succumbing to a fever, though locals swore they saw her ghost in a white gown, walking near the church for years afterward. Even childbirth, already fraught with mortal danger, sometimes produced eerie tales. In parts of Wales and Cornwall, midwives spoke in hushed voices about the changeling birth, a superstition claiming that if a marriage was cursed or entered under false vows, the first child might be swapped by fairies for a sickly, otherworldly infant. These children, often born with deformities or chronic illness, were thought to be omens that the marriage would end in ruin. The belief in marital curses wasn't confined to peasants. In 14th century Florence, the high-profile union between Count Alessandro di Rinaldi and Lady Bianca Rossi was marred by a series of calamities. The sudden death of their first three children, a fire that consumed their palazzo, and a mysterious wasting illness that struck both spouses. Gossip in the city claimed Bianca's dowry jewels had been stolen generations earlier and cursed by their rightful owner, a wrong never avenged. The couple died within weeks of each other, and their palazzo stood empty for decades, rumored to be haunted. Some of the strangest tales involve physical phenomena during or after the wedding itself. In parts of Bavaria, records mention black candle weddings, where candles supposedly flickered with unnatural blue flames during the vows. Should have died, but didn't, and the community interpreted it as supernatural intervention. In Yorkshire, a young bride poisoned by her in-laws supposedly revived after 3 days in a death-like coma. She claimed she had been led back to life by a figure she described as neither man nor angel, who told her she had unfinished work. She lived for another decade, during which her in-laws fled the county in disgrace. Not all unexplained events were sinister. Folktales tell of blessed marriages, where couples wed for love rather than alliance and seem to enjoy extraordinary fortune, thriving children, bountiful harvests, and uncanny escapes from disaster. The Church saw these as examples of divine favor, though skeptics suspected embellishment. Still, such stories offered a counterpoint, a tantalizing suggestion that fate could be kind, even in a cruel age. But whether in whispers of ghosts, curses, or miraculous rescues, these accounts show how deeply people believed that unseen forces could shape a marriage's fate. In a world without modern science, the line between coincidence and curse was razor thin, and once crossed, it could never be erased. And while some of these stories have faded into the mists of time, the impact of medieval marriage and its dangers has echoed far beyond the grave. In fact, its legacy is still with us today, hiding in plain sight. Though the medieval world is long gone, the shadow of its marriage customs still lingers in our laws, our traditions, and even in the stories we tell. Many wedding rituals today have roots in practices that centuries ago were tied to survival or control. The custom of exchanging rings, for example, was not just a romantic symbol. It was originally a visible marker of legal ownership. Carrying the bride over the threshold? That echoes both ancient Roman and medieval superstitions about protecting the wife from evil spirits that might dwell at the doorway. Or, more practically, about showing the husband's strength and dominance. Even the language we use about marriage, phrases like giving the bride away, has medieval origins. In those days, it was literally a transfer of authority from father to husband, documented in contracts and blessed by the Church. Legal systems in many countries still bear traces of coverture, the medieval doctrine that erased a woman's independent legal identity when she married. While most such laws have been repealed, their echoes persist. Well into the 20th century, married women in some countries could not own property in their own name or open a bank account without a husband's consent. The legacy also lives on in literature and media. Countless historical dramas romanticize medieval weddings with flowing gowns, torchlit feasts, and noble vows, but often leave out the grim realities, the danger of childbirth, the lack of legal rights. Middle Ages. Arranged marriages and power-driven unions remain central plot points, proof that the medieval model still shapes how we imagine historic romance. Superstitions, too, survive in surprising ways. The idea that certain days are unlucky for weddings traces back to medieval calendars that marked times of famine, plague, or religious taboo. Bridal charms, something old, something new, and even throwing rice all have faint connections to beliefs about fertility, prosperity, and warding off evil from the newlyweds' home. In recent decades, there's been a growing academic interest in uncovering the lived reality of medieval marriages, especially for women and the poor. Historians now draw on court records, parish registers, and archaeological evidence to reconstruct what life was actually like behind the romanticized facade. This research often confirms what folklore has hinted at for centuries, that marriage in the Middle Ages was as much a contract of survival as it was a union of hearts. But perhaps the most enduring influence is psychological. The idea that marriage is an unbreakable, binding contract, even when harmful, has deep roots in medieval religious doctrine. While modern societies increasingly recognize divorce and personal choice, many cultural and religious traditions still carry the weight of those older, stricter views. The Middle Ages may be over, but the ghosts of its marriages, both literal and metaphorical, still walk among us. They appear in our language, our customs, our laws, and our collective imagination, quietly reminding us of a time when happily ever after was the exception, not the rule. And yet, for all the progress we've made, one question remains. If you found yourself transported back to the medieval world, could you survive a marriage there? Or would it destroy you? So now you know. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not the fairy tale ceremony of embroidered gowns, sweet music, and eternal romance that modern fiction so often paints. It was a gamble, sometimes a death sentence, wrapped in the solemn words of the church and the cold ink of a contract. It was a world where a wedding could be the beginning of a political alliance or the prelude to a grave, where love was rare, survival uncertain, and freedom a privilege almost no one could afford. The evidence is there in the marriage contracts that read like business deals, in the court records that barely acknowledged abuse, in the whispered folk tales of cursed brides and deadly bedding nights. And it is there too in the modern customs that carry the faint echo of those days, a reminder that the past is never truly gone. So, if you were to stand in a medieval chapel today, candlelight flickering against cold stone walls, could you say, "I do," knowing what came next? Could you face the public spectacle, the loss of personal freedom, the danger of childbirth or political intrigue, and still believe in the promise of a life together? Or would you, like so many before you, find yourself trapped in a vow that could cost everything? That's the haunting question history leaves us with. And it's a question worth asking, not just about the Middle Ages, but about how far we've truly come since then. Because for all our progress, echoes of those old dangers remain, in the laws that still limit personal choice, in cultures that pressure people into unions they do not want, and in the idea that marriage must be endured at any cost. History has shown us that survival in a medieval marriage took cunning, resilience, and, perhaps most of all, luck. Without those, even the grandest wedding feast could end in tragedy. Now it's your turn. If you had to marry in the Middle Ages, knowing the risks, the customs, and the realities, what would you do? Would you take the risk for love, for family duty, or refuse entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's see how many of us would make it out alive. And if you found this journey into the darker side of history eye-opening, remember, there are countless more stories waiting in the shadows. Stories of haunted castles, vanished ships, and people who may have cheated death itself. So, subscribe to Hidden History Vault, turn on the notifications, and step with me into the past, where the line between survival and disaster was as thin as a wedding veil.